Okay, let's dive into this. There's been a major announcement from the U.S. government.
Yeah, regarding temporary protected status, TPS, for Afghan nationals.
Exactly. The Homeland Security Secretary, Kristi Noem, has announced it's being terminated. And there's a hard date, July 14th, 2025.
Right. And just so we're all clear, TPS itself, this status, it's been around since 1990. It's basically a temporary shield, for people who can't go back home safely because of, war or natural disasters, things like that. Serious, but temporary crises.
Temporary being the key word there, I suppose. And what we really want to do today is unpack this decision. Like, why now?
The potential impacts.
Yeah, and what are the different viewpoints? We need to look at it from all angles. We're talking about quite a few people.
It's around 11,700 Afghan TPS holders. That figure includes many who came over during Operation Allies Welcome.
That's important context. And remember, Afghanistan only got this TPS status back in May 2022.
It was the Biden administration, wasn't it? Responding to the Taliban takeover and, things falling apart there.
Precisely. And it was even extended September 2023, I think. So ending it now it's a big shift.
It definitely marks a change in policy, yes.
So let's get right into it. What's the official reason? What's the Department of Homeland Security actually saying about why they're ending this?
Okay, so the statement from Secretary Noem says DHS determined there have been, and I'm quoting here, notable improvements in the security and economic situation in Afghanistan.
Notable improvements.
Their assessment, basically, is that it's now safe enough, or safer anyway, for Afghans to return without facing, a major threat to their safety from the conflict or other extraordinary conditions.
And this wasn't just decided overnight?
No. They mentioned a USCIS review and talks with the State Department leading up to this conclusion.
Okay. Is there anything else driving this beyond the situation in Afghanistan itself?
Yeah. Secretary Noem also explicitly stated that letting Afghans stay under TPS is contrary to the national interests of the United States.
Contrary to the national interest? That's strong language.
It is. And it seems to tie into an executive order, 14159, from January this year. That order stressed that these temporary statuses should only last as long as strictly needed.
So there's a push to make sure temporary really means temporary.
Seems like it. It fits a wider theme of ensuring these statuses don't just become, indefinite stays by default. And there's also language about championing core American interests and putting American interests first, linking back to another executive order, 14150.
Okay, so national interest and temporary status, but what about those notable improvements? What actual evidence are they offering?
Well, this is interesting. The DHS notice points to increased tourism.
Tourism in Afghanistan.
Yeah. They cite numbers going from about 691 foreign tourists in 2021 up to 7,000 in 2023.
Wow, that's quite a jump.
It is. And they particularly highlight a massive, 913% increase in visitors from China since the Taliban regained control.
Okay. Tourism numbers. What else?
They also mention a reported drop in the rate of kidnappings. So those are the main indicators they're putting forward for improved security.
Tourism and fewer kidnappings. It feels quite different from what we often hear about the situation there.
It does, and that's exactly where the counter-arguments come flooding in. You have human rights groups, advocacy organizations, basically saying, hang on a minute.
Right, what are they saying?
They're painting a very different picture. They talk about worsening persecution by the Taliban. Things like public floggings, torture, forced conversions, even executions.
And the situation for women and girls.
That's a huge focus. Systematic denial of rights, bans on education, past primary school, bans on most employment, travel restrictions, even limits on healthcare access, speaking or singing in public. It's severe.
So one side says notable improvements, the other points to worsening persecution. That's a stark contrast.
It really is. These groups argue the claim of improved conditions is, one advocate called it unconscionable and divorced from reality.
Strong words.
Very. They emphasize the risks for specific groups. Human rights defenders, journalists, LGBTQ+ individuals, religious and ethnic minorities, anyone linked to the old government or U.S. forces.
People who specifically helped the U.S. and its allies.
Exactly. Groups like #AfghaniVac are saying this decision feels like it's based on politics, not the reality on the ground, citing ongoing assassinations and arbitrary arrests. There's a real sense that the U.S. might be abandoning its allies.
And what about the practical impact, like the immigration system?
Well, experts like Julia Gillette from the Migration Policy Institute see this as a, quote, stark reversal for Afghan allies. ending TPS is likely to push thousands of people into the asylum system.
Which is already backlogged, right?
Hugely backlogged, so this could make things much worse. And think about the human cost. The UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, reports over 9 million refugees and internally displaced people connected to Afghanistan. That's like, what, over 20% of the population?
5 million, that's staggering.
It is. And even congressional researchers found no significant improvement in Afghanistan's situation, calling it maybe the most repressive country in the world regarding women's rights.
So official government assessment versus congressional research, UN reports, human rights groups, very different takes.
Completely different. And you hear stories, too, from people working directly with refugees here. Community members tutoring Afghan families talk about how eager they are to learn and contribute, but also how terrified they are about being sent back.
I can only imagine the fear.
There are even reports of refugees getting threatening letters and concerns about the psychological toll, people reportedly contemplating suicide out of fear of returning. It's deeply concerning.
It really puts a human face on these policy decisions. Now, you mentioned legal challenges earlier.
Yes, there's already a lawsuit filed. An organization called CASA is suing Secretary Noem and DHS.
On what grounds?
A couple of things. They argued DHS didn't use the proper official channels to cancel TPS and didn't give the required 60 days notice.
Procedural issues.
Right. But also substantive ones. They maintain that conditions in Afghanistan still meet the criteria for TPS ongoing conflict, extraordinary conditions. And they argue ending it violates due process.
So that lawsuit could potentially change things, or at least delay them.
It could certainly complicate the timeline and the implementation. We'll have to see how that plays out in court.
Okay, so looking ahead, the termination date is set for July 14th, 2025. Are there any sort of interim measures?
DHS did announce an automatic extension for some employment authorization documents, EADs. Those set to expire November 2023 or May 2025 are now extended through July 14, 2025.
So people can keep working legally for a bit longer?
For a bit longer, yes. But it doesn't solve the underlying issue of their status expiring. Advocacy groups like Global Refuge are pushing hard for the administration to reverse course or at least issue another extension, maybe 6 months.
And beyond extensions.
The bigger push is for Congress to act. There's been talk for a while about an Afghan Adjustment Act, which would give Afghans a more stable, potentially permanent legal pathway.
Right, something more secure than TPS.
Exactly. Without something like that, you're looking at immense pressure on immigration lawyers and, as we said, the asylum system. Plus, you have situations like Pakistan continuing to expel Afghans back into Afghanistan, which just adds another layer of danger.
And this isn't the first time Afghan resettlement has faced hurdles in the U.S. recently, is it?
No, the previous Trump administration had put a freeze on resettlement for Afghans at one point. So there's a history of policy shifts affecting this population.
Okay, so summing up, we have the administration citing improved conditions, national interest, the temporary nature of TPS.
And on the other side, human rights organizations, legal challenges, advocates pointing to ongoing dangers, severe human rights abuses, especially for women and minorities, and a sense of betrayal towards allies.
It's a really complex picture with deeply conflicting views, and that July 14, 2025 date is getting closer.
Thousands of people's lives hang in the balance, really, depending on how this unfolds.
So, for you listening, trying to wrap your head around this, you've got these clashing narratives about what's actually happening in Afghanistan. You've got the debate about national interest versus, well, humanitarian responsibility. It forces you to think, doesn't it?
Definitely.
What should really drive these kinds of immigration policies when you're dealing with global crises? How do you weigh competing factors? And maybe the biggest question, what responsibility, if any, does a country like the U.S. have towards people who directly helped its efforts in places like Afghanistan, especially when their safety is still very much at risk?
Thanks, Liz.
Yeah, certainly a lot to think about.